Hi, I'm presenting on my African music paper, which connects John Chernoff's African rhythm and African sensibility with the Dagomba dance drumming monograph available online. So the first thing I looked at was Chernoff's analysis of musical aesthetic, and the second thing that I really wanted to look at is his analysis of African socio-musical aesthetic, how music connects to society. I analyzed Zimtai Kulga, a Dagomba praise name piece, to kind of highlight the musical parts. I also composed my own piece, which I'll present at the end. So the first thing I looked at in terms of musical characteristics was this notion of an implied beat. This implied beat for Chernoff always kind of exists, and musicians know about it, but they don't rely on it to keep their time, and I thought that was really interesting. For the audience, finding that beat is actually part of how they appreciate the music and how they derive pleasure from it. I wanted to compare this musical characteristic to the idea of an implied tonic in Western music. The same way that there might be two rhythms in African music, there's usually multiple pitches being sounded, producing harmony. And the implicit tonic doesn't need to be sounded all the time, because if you're acculturated in Western music, then you would understand the pleasure or the anticipation that that home key or that tonic creates. The second thing I wanted to look at in Chernoff was tension resolution dynamics. He talks a lot about how the fact that musicians are in dialogue with each other means that one rhythm defines another. And one participates by listening to this, what he calls tension in time. And the only way that that can happen is with that implied beat and an ensemble trying to play around it. And with that kind of tension and resolution dynamic, you get this tapestry of rhythm. Again, I compared this with Western concepts of tension resolution in a pitch context. Though it might sound kind of disjunct if you're not acculturated in Western music, something like a contrapuntal Bach fugue has all these different ideas happening at the same time, and they have tension in time, essentially, except with harmonic cadences. And they, I argue, affect the listener in the same way that African music might affect an African listener. The third thing that I looked at was the complexity of African music. Chernoff talks a lot about how African music creates a complex tapestry of rhythm because there's all these interlocking patterns with one another, and they offer multiple interpretations for the listener. He says that Western listeners, whether they admire or detract from African music, they just don't understand it. And this whole complex interweaving is actually what creates the sort of magic of African music, if you really do understand it. I also think that this analogy holds in Western music as well, because there's a complex tapestry of harmony. Even Western listeners have complained about the complexity sometimes of Western classical music harmonically. I used Beethoven's Grosse Fugue as an example of this. And the same way that African listeners enjoy contrasting rhythmic patterns woven together, Western listeners enjoy contrasting pitch patterns woven together in harmony. I then decided to do an analysis of Zimtai Kulga, drawing on each of these three features and showing how they relate, and whether Chernoff's assertions are actually valid. So Zimtai Kulga is piece in ternary duple meter, and it sort of exhibits all three of these characteristics. So the first thing to note is just the remarkable regularity and symmetry of the piece. The length of the entire part is 8 measures, and they're neatly split into 2 phrases, which I call A and B. And you'll notice that A and B are also separated into 2 phrases that are each 2 measures. And the morphology sort of shows the whole implied beat idea, because the gungong response to the lunga always starts on the 6th ternary beat of every measure. And that creates a sort of, one could say, pickup or offbeat But this whole sense of an implied beat that everyone understands is really strong in that particular area. When we analyze the actual motives, then you can kind of see the dynamics of tension resolution. In addition to the pickup that we just talked about, there's also a binary feel that is happening at the same time that a ternary feel is happening. In the measures 6 and measures 8, we have the Anserlunga dividing up the beat in binary beats, and the Gungang dividing it into ternary beats. And this creates a lot of tension and resolution because it's unclear which of those breakdowns of the beat is actually the what you might call real breakdown. And from this directly, the whole idea of complex rhythm and multiple interpretations emerges pretty naturally. One thing that's really interesting is that the lead lunga part resolves on a quarter note with a series of 8 notes on the third ternary beats of measures 2 and 4. And the Gungang, as we said, has its first impulses on the 6th ternary beat of measures 2 and 4. So this is really easy to confuse a non-African listener into knowing, which beat is really the one, because it's really easy to think that the third ternary beat or the 6th ternary beat is actually the one when it's not. I actually go into this in my piece, but first I want to touch on Chernoff's analysis of socio-musical aesthetic and how he compares African and Western music. He claims that in African music, the two kind of taboo behaviors are being random and having individualistic tunnel vision. In a musical context, what this basically means is that you should not be randomly expressing yourself, but participating in the formal structure. It also means that in a social context, you should be open to communication and hospitable to strangers. And even though Chernoff says that this is a distinctly African sort of idea, in comparison to individualistic Western culture, I think he ignores the music of the African diaspora when talking about this. Music of the African diaspora shares a number of characteristics of African music, and I think understanding those kind of brings all of his claims into a little more complications. First of all, there's a lot of subcultures in jazz where what he calls random improvisation is actually pretty taboo as well. What Chernoff calls single-mindedness of purpose also doesn't seem to apply to jazz, which kind of has a more developed understanding of musical dialogue the way that Africans might understand it. He also emphasizes the way that music is socially integrated into African society, and I think, again, he discounts the way that music of the African diaspora closely weaves in with African American society. He does say that music is sort of one of the unities that exists among African cultures, but for some reason he still paints this dichotomy. For the African diaspora, work songs, slave spirituals, and prison songs have been formative musical influences. Gospel music, which is played in churches, has been formative in kind of making the musical and the social intimately related. The last thing that Chernoff talks about, which I actually think is a very valid claim, is that African music interprets participation uniquely. He says it's the most fundamental aesthetic in Africa. And in this sense, the audience is not different from the musicians. They are not supposed to be kind of on the edges just listening. They are actually participating either through hand clapping or dancing. And not only are they just feeling the implied beat of the music, they're adding yet another strand to the tapestry. And sort of trying to explain this vis-a-vis Western music, I sort of thought about having 3 tiers of participation, 3 levels. Whereas African music is on one end of the spectrum, the other end of the spectrum might be represented by Western classical music, where it's probably very, very rude to actually do anything during a performance other than sit quiet and clap at the end. However, African American music, or music of the African diaspora, is sort of in the intermediate level where the audience does participate either by cheering on the performers or by clapping their hands to the beat. And I think that when he ignores music of the African diaspora, it sort of creates this dichotomous picture between Western and African music, whereas musical diffusion has actually created a lot more complications in that sort of spectrum. And lastly, I just want to play to you a piece that I composed. I tried to keep the harmonic rhythm kind of in line with the way that Zimtai Kulga functions, where the ternary beats 3 and 6 are actually really emphasized by the entrances of the lunga and the gongong. In terms of the actual harmonic progression, I tried to draw from the African musical aesthetic where you can have multiple cognitive interpretations. So I hope you can see how there's sort of multiple tonics or multiple home keys that sound like they are plausible in the piece. Excuse me.